This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by AASA, that's AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I'm a member and you can become one too. Membership is very reasonably priced and comes with a host of benefits. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Public's book series from Sydney University Press. This is a great collection of books about animal studies. Have you had a chance to take a look at their forthcoming title? Rick DeVos's edited collection Decolonising Animals, I quote, brings together critical interrogations, case studies and creative explorations that identify and examine how non-human animals are affected by and respond to colonial structures and processes. Also a shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updating theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthews.com. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to someone I met when he gave a visiting paper at the Sheffield Animal Studies Research Centre. Dr. Troy Vettese is a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute. He's an environmental historian who, in addition to animal studies, has expertise in energy history and environmental economics. Today, we're going to talk about his book Half-Earth Socialism, a plan to save the future from extinction, climate change and pandemics, which was co-authored with Drew Pendergrass and published by Verso in 2022. Welcome to the podcast, Troy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Could you start by telling us what led to you writing this book?
So we wrote the book because we were not happy with my co-author and I were not really happy with, I suppose, this current state of environmental debates. I think there's always like a really good analysis of why we're in a mess and, climate change and so forth. But then the solutions are always very vague or they don't seem sufficient. I think for environmental books, it's always like this insufficient set of answers, like, changing light bulbs or cycling more or whatever it is. It never seems like it's up to the actual task. Or socialist books where the socialist horizon is very blurry. It's not really clear what socialism is. And then the book just ends. And we wanted to think more seriously about what does it actually look like to live in an ecologically stable society where everyone can live a good life and we actually can escape this environmental crisis? The other thing we were trying to do was, several years ago, I was just reviewing lots of books because books are expensive. And if you review books, you get them free. So that's quite nice. And I was getting these books sent to me and I was reading a bit more widely than maybe I would have had I been choosing the books myself. And I read a few of them, including E.O. Wilson's Half-Earth, and then also Vaclav Smil's book on power density and some other things. And I realized that there's a certain problem of land that links all these environmental problems, where we don't have enough land to actually solve problems in terms of climate change, where we have to deal with carbon sequestration at a large scale, or we have to conserve land and also the oceans to protect species, and we also need lots of land for this renewable energy transition. So we wanted to combine these things. So again, we wanted to kind of write a different kind of book, and we wanted to address more than just climate change, but these other facets of the environmental crisis.
You talked about your worry about the fuzzy future, the fuzzy, unclear future in a lot of socialist texts, and you're offering quite a specific vision for what this socialist future might look like. And I've got a few questions about where animals fit into the vision. But first, could you offer us a sketch of the utopia that you're championing?
So we draw quite a bit from this philosopher named Otto Neurath, who is well known if you care about the Vienna Circle group of philosophers or care about graphic design, but otherwise he's largely forgotten, even among socialists. And he's interesting because he's an openly utopian thinker, and he says utopian thinking is not just is not daydreaming, but actually is practical work of imagining the future and then working towards that future. But also it's got a component of socialist democracy where we have to decide amongst ourselves what these futures are. And what we're doing in the book is we're trying to revive that and saying like this is how a socialist governance would actually function by having a choice between these like different total plans, but and also encourage people to imagine these futures. And we propose our own total plan for this utopia, but we don't expect everyone to agree with that. But we want to have a debate, because I think right now people, they talk about the environmental crisis, they talk about like one small aspect of it, and then they criticize other ideas, but it never adds up to a totality that is convincing. So like, are electric cars good, or is veganism enough, or do we need to have LED lights, or whatever it is, like how does it actually add up in a way? And this is what we're trying to do in the book, is to have this totality. So for us, we think there's always going to be a trade-off between basically three things, and these are the different environmental traditions, and they deal with these trade-offs in different ways. So you either have like high population, so like a Malthusian would say we need to lower the population, either with coercion or hopefully with less coercion, but generally we're quite skeptical and critical of the Malthusian tradition. You can have high living standards, so this is where like a kind of more Promethean socialist would actually want to have maximize this component, or you could have like a stable environment, but you really can only have two out of these three things. And for us, again, we're against Malthusianism. And so we're saying we want to maximize, I suppose, a stable biosphere with a relatively high population. And that means a trade-off in terms of living standards. So for us, we say if you have veganism, you solve a huge number of problems in terms of land use. It frees up a lot of land. So we have space for rewilding and renewable energy. And we also want energy quotas, which also mean that we don't need as much space for renewable energy build out and so forth. So that is like the main combination. And then the other thing we are interested in is in terms of socialist planning, is that we're not market socialists, which is what many socialists are. They want to mimic the market. And we're saying we have to rely on physical units and non-market mechanisms, because with market socialism you tend towards recovering aspects of capitalism and then reverting back to capitalism, such as unemployment or bankruptcy and other forms of capitalist coercion. And to avoid that, you have to rely on planning. But planning without markets or money is extremely hard. So we're trying to get into that as well.
So you're arguing for a vegan future and a future in which half of the earth is rewilded. And that's something that I think a lot of animal studies scholars could really get on board with. And perhaps there's an affinity in your work with a lot of utopian animal studies work. But what's interesting is that your arguments for this, you talked about land use just then, are in many ways highly anthropocentric. So would it be fair to say that claims about what we owe animals themselves actually play only a relatively small part in your case?
Well, thanks for bringing attention to the argument about land use. So really it's like energy quotas, veganism, and this like huge scale rewilding, right? I mean, increasing the number of nature preserves from like 15% to 50%, which is a big deal, but what's actually necessary to prevent mass extinction. And this is a controversial part of the book, but this is also where we get the title of Half-Earth Socialism. In terms of, are we making a human-centered argument for animal rights and for veganism? We are in the book, and that is not because we necessarily are focused on that for our own views. Like both Drew and I are ethical vegans. The thing is, we want to convince people, especially socialists, because lots of socialists don't care about animals and have this Promethean view that we have to dominate nature to create this abundance that will create this socialist utopia where everyone has everything. And we have to convince those people that that dream is impossible, and actually we would be better off by being vegan and by giving more space to nature. So we're making this, I don't know about cynical, but like a practical argument. And we also are trying to, I suppose, declutter the argument by having this Neuratian focus about these different utopias, and then from there making certain sets of arguments based on those utopias, which have to do with this planning mechanism. I'm interested in writing an essay on socialist ethics, as in like, how can you visit the Marxist tradition and find a case for caring about animal alienation or the plight of animals within Marxism? I think you can do that, and that's something I want to work on, but we don't do it in this case. And I think, again, I study neoliberals for my day job, right? Like, this is a side project. And with neoliberals, they give like 10 arguments for everything, and they see what sticks. And I think people who care about animal rights should do the same thing, where you throw out a lot of arguments, and that's going to convince different people without really having a certain preference for either one, or whatever works, I think is good for the movement.
Yeah, I've got a lot of sympathy with that view. I've got another question for you about animals in this utopian vision. Do you see Half-Earth Socialism as an abolitionist project? So lots of utopian visions in animal studies stress new ways for humans and animals to interact, but domesticated animals seem to be all but absent from the future you envisage.
This is a controversial part of the book, even within amongst Drew and myself. I think maybe I disagree where exactly to put that line. Which animals are liberated and which animals maybe would still be eaten or hunted and so forth. And I, for example, would support indigenous rights, and I actually am not troubled by indigenous hunting, for example. But I think the question about, let's say, peasant use of animals is more difficult. The book has been criticized by peasant scholars and peasant socialists, such as like Max Al, for instance, because they see this as a threat to this peasant way of life. I'm not 100%, I suppose, committed, but I do lean towards a total abolition of animal husbandry. I think it's necessary for practical reasons, as in if you look at meat consumption, still a third of all meat consumption is produced by smaller scale farmers. So it's still a lot of animals, and that's still a huge amount of land being used. Like more than 1 billion hectares of land would be needed to support those animals. And I think there's also the ethical reason why we should care even for peasant agriculture. And I think one also has to remember that philosophers and activists have been criticizing even, this old-fashioned form of animal husbandry for a long time. In the book, we talk about Plato's critique of meat consumption. So even when everyone was a peasant, you still had people criticizing peasant forms of animal agriculture. So I think there's many reasons. I'm not as fully committed to that point as I am definitely for abolishing factory farming. But I think this is something we should be debating as socialists and as people who care about animals. And I also have other unpopular opinions, such as I'm writing something right now for The Guardian that would make the case for ending pet ownership, which is controversial amongst vegans as well. So I'm a bit more of a hardliner, I suppose. But I think we should be talking about these things. It's been funny also, like in the book, we actually avoid the term universal veganism, right? Or mandatory veganism. And again, because Drew and I maybe differed about how hard to be on this point. What's funny is that some socialists are coming around to this. For example, Andreas Malm, who some people may know for writing the book How to Blow Up a Pipeline and Fossil Capital and other things, is an interesting eco-socialist thinker. And he wrote in his book on the coronavirus that there should be like draconian controls to enforce mandatory veganism. That's something I'm quite sympathetic to, but it's interesting to see the left actually kind of change on this position. But it's still very hard. I mean, when I go on other podcasts, socialist podcasts, I'm like hammered on this pretty much nonstop, rather than I think the more difficult problem, which is, how do you manage the global economy without money or markets? Like that is a harder problem than getting people to eat tofu, I would think. But people focus on the veganism.
Yeah, this focus on debate and discussion, this is brought to light in the book through this focus on radical democracy. This is an incredibly democratic proposal that you're making. But I suppose I've got a couple of questions about that. First of all, do you think there might be room for including animals' voices in democratic fora, in the kind of democratic fora that you're imagining? And if not, this is the second question, do you think there's a risk that animals' interests will be overlooked in these decision-making processes?
Would one bring in animal voices by having scientists or activists speak for animals, or how would one do that?
That could be one way of doing it. So I know that some people, for example, Alistair Cochrane, very big on the idea of representation of animals within a democratic system. Others, Eva Meyer, for example, talk about listening to animals' voices. I
think the attempt to directly include animals is slightly unconvincing. I think it's still going to be about people participating in these discussions. I think it is hard to include animals fully as equals in these debates. I do think that the environmental movement and the animal rights movement needs to be a lot bigger and more powerful for this vision to actually accomplish. Because let's say like whatever I'm proposing comes true and there's this socialist revolution and people abolish money in markets and all this, and they engage in these total plans, there's no reason they would automatically choose to embrace veganism, right? There's no reason why they would care about rewilding and all that. Obviously, plenty of socialists do not care about these things. Plenty of people do not care about these things. I think that's the problem with socialism in general, that there is no automatic utopia. I mean, we would still have to deal with problems of racism and sexism and homophobia and all these other problems. We would have to deal with them more directly instead of these problems being mediated through the market or facing or being distorted by the market in various ways. But they would still exist, right? Obviously, you can see in social societies, a lot of these problems still exist. The hope is that once you have these total plans, then veganism makes a lot of sense, right? Like once you see the world in its totality in terms of an economic system and a biospheric system, it's very hard to achieve many of your goals in terms of ecological stability while maintaining high rates of meat production. So that's like the wager of the book. And that's why in the book, we begin with this very dystopian future where there's like geoengineering and more pandemics and lots of inequality and basically showing that capitalism cannot solve the environmental crisis. And we have to consider something really quite radically different, which includes, veganism and socialism. But I think seeing these total visions makes a much stronger case for these radical proposals. And hopefully what the book does is create the basis for a broader coalition. Because right now we have animal rights people, we have environmentalists and conservationists, feminists, socialists, all fighting on different fronts. And they all are guided by their own ideology, right? And their own philosophical system, which contradict these other groups. And the point of the book is to try to criticize each group and connect them and kind of suture them together through this new ideology based on this Iraqi veganism. And that is a much larger group that can hopefully achieve its goals that these groups cannot solve by themselves.
Why do you think some of your socialist critics are so resistant to veganism? What is it about veganism that they don't like?
I think there's a certain conservatism within some socialist circles, as in they want to be like normal in some ways. They think that to be socialist and to win as socialist, you have to be as normie, as possible, and then talk to your normie friends and be like, actually, we have these interests and they're not being realized under capitalism, but you can keep all these other things you like. You just have to change things very slightly. And that's all you need. They ask very little, I suppose, of potential new socialist followers. And I think that's the road to success. Or maybe they actually like certain hierarchies that they benefit from within the current society, and then they want to maintain these things. This is where I think, especially in the United States, there's this real emphasis on like a class reductionist socialism, and therefore, gender and race and these other identities don't matter as much. The only identity that really matters is a class identity. I think that's a way of minimizing the role of other groups and also allowing, let's say, white men to maintain a certain privileged position. And I think there are not very many good reasons for socialists to be so abhorrent of veganism, but this has been very common. Like my book was reviewed in the New Left Review, which is a flagship journal for the left, and I was compared to Pol Pot for trying to take people's hamburgers away, which is obviously a very incredibly stupid argument. But I think it's revealing that someone could equate something so basic to genocide at some level. And I think the other problem is that its refusal to engage in utopian thinking on the left, which the left has been very bad at doing for a very long time, means that they can only imagine a future where you're trying to maximize GDP, you're trying to just get more stuff. And that's the only, as in they're equating more commodities to the good life, right? And they're trying to realize the promise of capitalism rather than saying socialism is an opportunity for us to govern ourselves and choose a very different way of living. And they've given up on this latter way of thinking and chosen the former, and it's not great, right? But in the book we get into this utopian socialist history because obviously 200 years ago many people on the left were vegetarian, and that has gone away, and we're trying to recover this tradition on the left.
So is that a Marxist tradition or is that a non-Marxist socialist tradition? Because I know you're actually quite critical in the book of Marx and these attempts to look at Marx through green-tinted spectacles.
So to be clear, I am a Marxist, but I think that doesn't prevent one from being critical of Marx.
Yes.
And it's been very weird as well to be called by fellow socialist, like a non-Marxist, just because I criticize Marx, as if like Daddy Marx has to be right about everything to be a Marxist. I mean, Marx was wrong about plenty of things. I mean, there's even a text that he wrote where he was convinced that, was it like Lord Palmerston was a Russian agent, and he wrote this entire conspiracy theory on this, and no Marxist talks about this book, but Marx was very obsessed with this. As in, Marx is not always right about everything, and Marx did not care about animals or nature, right? I don't think he did. And this attempt to, make Marx green, I find unconvincing, because I think he still, like, his vision is that at the end of history, we will have fully humanized nature in this Hegelian fashion, but it will be done rationally in some way. But therefore, it's still possible to fully control nature. And the book argues that that isn't possible, right? As in, the attempt to dominate nature leads to these problems that we cannot foresee. And zoonotic disease is probably the best example of this, as in when we interfere in ecosystems, pretty much any kind of disturbance can produce a certain disease, be it even animal testing or suburbs or exotic pets or whatever. They can all produce disease, which can kill us, right? And because we are interfering in a system we do not fully understand, so therefore we can't predict the results. And that's why the book calls for this half-Earth, as in we depend on this system we do not fully understand. And we have to make sure it is large enough to maintain its stability, because we depend on this. And I think Marxists just refuse to acknowledge that. So we are looking to this utopian tradition. People like Shelley, for instance, who's an important thinker and vegetarian, or there's like Oswald, who was a Jacobin and vegetarian and all that. And there's plenty of people in this tradition who are not Marxist. And I think the problem with Marxists is that, and I'm still working on this problem basically, like, why is Marx so opposed to animal rights and caring about the natural world, is my guess is that he's dealing with this Malthusian critique of utopia, right? Malthus says Godwin's vision of utopia is impossible because people always make more children, and they'll become poor again, and there will always be scarcity. And therefore, Marx's counter to that is this focus on abundance, this incredible abundance, which doesn't exist in the same way for other socialist thinkers at the time. They imagine a simpler kind of socialist society, and with Marx, it is super abundant techno-utopia that is the solution. And therefore, if you want this abundance, you have to dominate nature, and therefore you cannot care very much about animal rights at that point. But I think more work needs to be done to really clarify why Marx is like such a Promethean at some level. I think that hasn't been really clearly drawn out, and why there's been this break between this Promethean left and this animal rights left that existed beforehand.
Well, that's fascinating, and it links very neatly to the next question I was going to ask you about, which is about technology and techno-utopianism. You seem in the book very resistant to technological solutions to the problems that you identify, the environmental problems. Some of your harshest criticism in the book is reserved for cultivated meat, geoengineering, nuclear power, and other potential solutions like that. So there are, as you well know, what we might call techno-utopian socialists who defend these kind of technologies as our way to a utopian future. Why are you more skeptical?
So I think amongst the left now, and the left more broadly, as in they have these eco-modernist Marxists, and then you have maybe the more anarchist, degrowthy side of things, and who want these like small-scale communes and everyone has a goat and whatever, versus this total domination of nature where there's like 1 million nuclear power plants and geoengineering on the other side. And our book is like really, I think, in the middle of these things, right? It doesn't belong to either tradition. It's, I think, not technophobic, where we're quite happy to draw on advanced, climatic modeling and to rely on, solar power and many other technologies. But there's also a recognition that we have very little time, and to expect, say, new technologies to emerge and then to be deployed at scale is not reasonable, right? So, for example, something like fusion, right? Can we wait another 30 years to develop it? Will it ever be developed? And therefore, will it ever be deployed at scale? I'm not going to hold my breath for that. Other solutions, I think, are also fairly underwhelming, right? I think we don't live in this period of, let's say, the 1950s when this technological future seemed really impressive in a way, because there were some really, I think, impressive leaps in terms of technology. I think we actually live in a period where technological change is difficult and the gains are actually relatively modest. So let's talk about nuclear for a second. So nuclear has many problems. We get into the book, and like, one big thing is that it's not as a carbon neutral as people make it out to be. Once we actually build a lot of nuclear reactors and start using up all the easy to access deposits of uranium, then it's going to take a lot more energy to get the other harder to access uranium that's much more dispersed. And therefore the carbon intensity will increase quite a lot. And if the carbon intensity is very high, there's no point to having and building thousands of new reactors, right? And people like James Hansen, who's a prominent nuclear activist, he's not an idiot. Like, he recognizes this, but his solution are breeder reactors. And these are reactors that produce plutonium as a byproduct, and therefore you can use more fuel. And lots of other technomodernists like breeder reactors. The thing is, breeder reactors are actually a very old technology, and they don't work because if you have any kind of air leak, the coolant will combust with air, and therefore these things are always on fire. So I think this technological horizon is like pretty sad. I mean, the other things we talk about in the book are geoengineering, which again, more and more socialists are embracing, and other environmentalists are embracing, because they realize the world is very hot, and we have not done anything to actually reduce carbon emissions. And at some point, it will become inevitable to actually cool the earth so we are not always suffering these constant climatic crises. But we do not know what will happen once we actually start injecting sulfur or something else into the atmosphere, because the climatic system is so complex. And we will almost certainly wreck precipitation patterns. We will turn the sky white. We will lower the efficacy of solar power. We're going to screw up the rhythms of countless of animals. And one can go on and on. There are many things that are going to go wrong with this technology. So I think we should realize or think like what are the technologies that we like and are useful, as I said, like solar power, but also like simpler, like rewilding, which again can sequester a huge amount of carbon, for instance, or even something simple like I don't really care about autonomous cars, right, or self-driving cars. I think we just need more trains and subways and things like that. I mean, that's just use what works. But I think we also need to have a global governance, and we need to have these like large scale centralized plans to manage global problems. And that's where we're very different from this like small scale degrowthy approach. So like we're in between, and I think people aren't really quite sure what to do with the book, but I don't think technology will save us, no. And I'll say one more thing about cultivated meat. I'm just not convinced it will present the breakthrough that people expect. I think getting people to eat less or no meat is always going to be a political problem. And I think people eat meat because of status in terms of class and also like their gender. And I am not sure that cultivated meat will actually be able to fulfill those social functions, because those social functions depend on violence. And I think, cultivated meat may become something like, electric cars, where it's like a niche market, but it will not replace the rest of the industry. And doing that will take political work about abolishing that industry. And will it make that goal easier? Maybe, but we have plenty of meat substitutes now, but it's still very hard to abolish the meat industry. So I would focus on that, or not depend on cultivated meat to realize that victory. And I think some utilitarian scholars think it's going to be some silver bullet, and I don't share that optimism.
Now, Troy, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Let's do it.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
When I was a child, I was very into animals and was reading lots of books on sharks and things like that. But in terms of a more adult book, something in between childhood and perhaps my adulthood would be Eating Animals, which is a very basic book. I'm slightly embarrassed to say. I was in my early 20s and I read Saffron Foer's book, Eating Animals, and that actually pushed me to become vegetarian.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
It either was my essay to freeze the Thames, which became the basis for this book, or it was a Marxist theory of extinction, where I try to use conceptual tools from Marxism to explain why capitalism produces more extinction than any other society.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
It would be Ken Fish. So he wrote a book called Living Factories, which tries to understand genetically modified animals as the realization of capital's impulse to humanize nature and redirect natural flows towards making commodities. And that book has been a huge influence on my thinking as an eco-socialist, and I highly recommend it.
And a great question for a utopian. If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Make everyone vegan.
What is it you're working on next?
I would love to write something on birds, bird watching, and philosophy, and maybe this idea of birding as a way of relating to animals in a respectful way that allows them to maintain their autonomy, but also allows us to get close to nature at the same time. I'm a big bird watcher, and I just love reading books about birds, and maybe I'll write an essay on it.
And how can people find out more about your work?
They can go to Half-Earth. That's where we have the website for the book. We have a video game over there where you can play as a planetary planner. You can see where we're giving talks and there's reviews and all that. Otherwise, you can go to my academia.edu page where there's a list of my publications. And feel free to write to me as well. I'm always happy to hear from people.
Well, thanks so much, Troy, for joining us for this podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Please do tell others about us and review the podcast where you found it. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.